Okay, this is something I've just begun working on. Not too familiar with John Dewey. I believe his name's John Dewey, as in the Dewey Decimal System. Um, he he had a very pragmatic view of life, and I ran across a quote of his where he said, "Thinking is a process of activity." Dexter has something to say. He's got a sneeze in. Are you done? All right, buddy. He's always got to be the center of attention. Hold on, hold on, hold on. I just started this. Okay, so I quoted this because it stood out to me, because the point of the quote is really to say that first you have activity, whatever that activity is, maybe some kind of motion or something, or some kind of a firing of electrical impulses or whatever. Um, you have some sort of activity, and then you have thinking. So thinking is a process of activity. So I started thinking about that today, and I felt like having fun with Newton's laws, I guess, and certain things that I was reading regarding Dewey's philosophy kind of led me down this road where um, I could characterize uh, the thought process a little easier. So if we just look, this stands for summation. So what happens is basically it takes a certain amount of force to enact change in something. And if something isn't changing, the implication is that it's either uh, doesn't have any forces acting on it, or it's operating at a constant velocity. So I didn't quite word, this is a first draft, so I didn't quite word the first statement here correctly, because I said if the sum of all forces is equal to zero, then thinking does not occur. Well, that's one of the possibilities. The other possibility is, well, thinking is occurring, but it's occurring at a constant velocity. Now, what that means, who knows? You know, a constant velocity could be it's idle, or it's been working on something for a prolonged period of time to where the electrical impulse summations um, make sense of it. Anyway, so the idea is then if the sum of all forces is not equal to zero, and it's not going to be less than zero, it'd be greater than zero, um, then activity has set the mind to work. Now, there again, it's a reflection of the quote up here, where thinking is a process of activity. So, if activity has occurred, uh, and the sum of all forces acting on the mind is greater than zero, then we know that the mind is at work. it, yeah. So uh, we'll ignore this last part here. This was me trying to break it down last night into. So I just said, okay, because you don't want to make a duality here. So the mind is the thinking. So the mind thinks. The mind is the thinking thing. So to act on the mind is to act on the thinking thing. So point there is not to make a partition between uh, the mind and the thought process. So what I'm showing here is it's a half-assed state transitions diagram, where it's basically just showing some force, cause unknown, but it's some form of activity that was acting on a mind which was in a static form, because as you see here, the sum of all forces is equal to 0, and this is a double arrow indicating an equilibrium stasis here, which I also graphically show down here. On the y-axis we have activity, on the x-axis we have time. So as this is flowing through in mental stasis, we're not going to see any. It's not going to be. There's not going to be an upward or downward deflection of the line. It's going to be horizontal, because it's going to be at a constant level of activity because of its constant velocity, or there's nothing going on at all. There's no thinking going on at all. So what we're showing here is then eventually sum of all forces exceeds 0, and I just made up this as a threshold, and when that threshold's reached by this force, the activity level in the mind is starting out as a kind of singular unity here, and it becomes more like sinusoidal, and the purpose of that is that first of all, any one of those can go off tangentially into another whole set of different graphs in state transitions, but I just kept it simple and just left it in this one spot. But it's showing that these are active forces that are going on, that are, every downward and every upward inflection is indicative of force change. But overall, you notice the activity level is constant. So what's happening is the stasis of the mind has caused active forces within the mind to create its own thoughts. So essentially it becomes like a generative function. And then here I'm just showing, well, eventually you go back to stasis,